Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to a new episode of our Letter to Vox podcast. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into an intellectual giant whose legacy is, well, it's complex, it's contradictory, and it's absolutely foundational to modern political and economic thought. We're talking about James Mill.
James Mill is a figure who I think really demands a fresh look. He was a Scottish historian, an expert economist, a political theorist, and a philosopher who, despite being frequently overshadowed by his remarkably famous son, John Stuart Mill, was arguably one of the most rigorous and uncompromising systematizers of classical liberal thought in the early 19th century.
Right. When you trace the lines of his influence, you see them running everywhere. I mean, they start with revolutionizing the governance structure of British India, setting a framework that lasted a century, and they extend all the way to codifying the classical economic principles.
The Ricardian school,
The Ricardian school. That would just dominate global policy for decades. He was an absolute force of intellectual discipline.
And that's the core tension we really need to explore today. Our mission is to unpack this colossal dual influence. We have to examine his role as a colonial historian, which, and we have to be upfront about this, is framed by a highly controversial and frankly often viciously critical viewpoint of the colonized. But at the very same time, we have to dissect his rigorous, almost mathematical attempt to formalize the science of economics in his seminal text, Elements of Political Economy. It's a study in how radical political thought and systematic economic theory can intersect with rigid imperial doctrines.
Okay, so let's unpack his biography first, because it's the story of a man who really bootstrapped himself right into the center of London's intellectual elite. James Mill, originally named James Mill, was born in 1773 in North Waterbridge, Scotland. And his background was decidedly humble. His father was a shoemaker, a small farmer.
And it's crucial here to note the role of his mother, Isabel Fenton. She was intensely ambitious for her son, making sure he got a high-quality education that was far above his station. And this ambition, it paid off. It all led to him studying at the University of Edinburgh, where he just excelled as a Greek scholar.
And he was initially destined for the church, right? He trained as a minister of the Church of Scotland. He was even ordained in October 1789. But this was a career path that it just didn't take.
It really didn't. He found little success in the ministry. And that intellectual trajectory moving from the pulpit to profound atheism and a deep criticism of the church, it just shows the radicalization that really defined his later life.
So the real turning point comes when he moves.
In 1802, when he moved to London.
Yeah.
He dedicated himself entirely to literary and journalistic work, editing publications like the Literary Journal and the St. James Chronicle. And that environment was just the perfect crucible for his emerging systematic mind.
And his dedication to this work led to his massive historical project, which started around 1805, the history of British India. He thought it would take 3 or 4 years.
And it took 12 years of his life. And this brings us to probably the most defining relationship of his entire career.
Bentham.
The relationship with Jeremy Bentham, exactly. In 1808, Mill, who's now fully entrenched in this historical research, meets Bentham, who was 25 years his senior. And this was just a profound convergence of minds. Mill adopted Bentham's utilitarian principles entirely, the whole idea that the morality of an action is determined by its ability to produce the greatest good for the greatest number.
And he didn't just adopt it, he almost weaponized it. He became Bentham's chief companion, his intellectual sounding board, and his key ally, basically transforming Bentham's philosophy into an applied political movement. And this just launched him right into the heart of philosophic radicalism.
Right, and maybe we should clarify what we mean by philosophic radicalism for you, the listener. This wasn't about, abstract revolution or natural rights theory. Mill thought that was all sentimental nonsense. It was a rigorous, systemic movement focused on applying rational, utilitarian calculation to specific institutional reform. They wanted to find the mechanism that would guarantee good governance.
Exactly. This group, led by Mill, aimed to bring this calculated reform to the world. He became this dominant, centralizing figure. His articles for publications like the Edinburgh Review, and particularly his contributions to the Encyclopedia Britannica supplement on subjects like jurisprudence, prisons, and his most famous political piece, Government, they were just enormously impactful. They drove that whole reform agenda.
And the political impact was immediate, it was tangible. Mill's writings helped engineer a fundamental shift in British politics. They moved the whole debate away from the abstract rights of man theories, those echoes from the French Revolution, and towards seeking concrete, securities for good government. And what that meant was arguing fiercely for a wider extension of the franchise.
So the logic is, if the government's purpose is utility, then the only way to ensure the government acts in the interest of the governed is to make the government accountable to the widest possible electorate.
That's it. It's a cold, rational calculation applied to political structure. That was his signature move.
And his persistence paid off. I mean, the pressure from the philosophic radicals, driven largely by Mill's systematic arguments, was a huge factor leading up to the British Reform Bill of 1832.
And while he was fighting for political liberation at home, the success of his 12-year project, The History of British India, was changing his personal fortunes completely. The book was published in 1818, and despite its controversial content, it secured him an official role the following year at India House, the headquarters of the East India Company.
That's a fascinating, almost ironic career trajectory. The historian who writes this massive, influential book about India, despite having never set foot there, then lands a powerful bureaucratic job overseeing Indian affairs.
And it was more than just a job. It was tremendous power. He rose steadily through the ranks, and it culminated in his appointment as head of the Examiner of Indian Correspondence Office in 1830. This position made him the administrative engine room of the British governance system in India. He was, in effect, implementing the very systems he had advocated for in his book.
All while raising a family, including his son, John Stuart Mill, who would, inherit, expand, and often critique the vast intellectual system his father had built. James Mill was, without question, a systemic, dominating thinker who sought to apply utilitarian calculus to every single facet of society. So here is where we confront the first massive contradiction in James Mill's utilitarian mission. His great historical project, The History of British India from 1817, it became a foundational text for British rule, yet its intellectual legacy is, well, it's deeply problematic. He was the first writer to formalize the division of Indian history into three parts: Hindu, Muslim, and British.
And that classification, which separated the pre-colonial era into these two distinct religious phases, was so problematic precisely because it set the stage for his imperial justification. By framing history primarily in religious terms, it minimized or just outright ignored the complex political, economic, and administrative continuities that existed across different dynasties in India.
And it perfectly aligned with his argument for imperialism. Mill was an explicit, unapologetic proponent of British control, and he viewed it through his utilitarian lens as a necessary civilizing mission.
He genuinely believed that. He thought the application of systematic British administration was the only way to improve Indian society and bring the greatest happiness to the greatest number.
But the inherent problem, and we really have to stress this, is the just astonishing hubris of this position. Mill never visited India.
Never. He relied entirely on documents, on archives, and the sometimes prejudiced accounts of travelers and administrators to construct this massive policy-shaping narrative.
This is a point that later critics, like the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen, really seized upon. How can a rigorous utilitarian who claims to base his philosophy on empirical observation write such a seminal history without any empirical first-hand knowledge of the society he's describing?
Well, Mill's defense would have been that his rational method transcended the need for messy empirical observation. He preferred the cold, rigorous logic of the archives. And this theoretical approach led him to conclude that Indian society was fundamentally barbaric, corrupt, and incapable of self-government, which was the justification for his entire policy platform.
The language he used is incredibly charged, and it's important to understand the depth of this British Indophobia, as it's been called, because this was the language of the governing authority. He portrays Indian society as morally and intellectually degraded. For instance, he wrote that under the glozing exterior of the Hindu lies a general disposition to deceit and perfidy.
And this condemnation was comprehensive. It didn't differentiate between faiths when he was assessing moral character. He asserted that both the Hindus and the Muslims shared the same insincerity, mendacity, and perfidy, the same indifference to the feelings of others, the same prostitution and venality. I mean, this isn't just historical commentary. It's an indictment of an entire civilization's capacity for rational governance.
And he goes into shocking detail when characterizing the Hindu. He described them as almost always penurious and ascetic, and even more strikingly, he claimed that the Hindu, like the eunuch, excels in the qualities of a slave.
It's just. And he further detailed physical and moral traits, claiming they were dissembling, treacherous, mendacious, to an excess which surpasses even the usual measure of uncultivated society, as well as cowardly and unfeeling and disgustingly unclean in their persons and houses. The cumulative effect of this writing was to solidify a powerful, deeply negative image of Indian society within the British administrative mind.
And what's crucial is the connection between this theoretical condemnation and his bureaucratic power. This wasn't just a book sitting on a shelf. When Mill, the author of this seminal condemnation, became the head of the Examiner of Indian Correspondence Office at India House in 1830, he held immense power to mandate policies based on these principles.
Precisely. His administrative position meant that he translated this intellectual condemnation directly into institutional change. Because he characterized the native population as morally and intellectually inferior, incapable of self-command, the bureaucratic mandate became to impose British administrative and legal systems top-down, with minimal consultation or respect for existing institutions.
Mm-hmm.
The goal shifted entirely toward rigorous utilitarian standardization, regardless of local custom.
So we see the profound impact. This intellectual, who was a radical, demanding political liberty and maximum self-command for individuals back in Britain, simultaneously laid the bureaucratic and ideological foundation for perpetual, unapologetic imperial domination abroad. And it was all based on a calculated utilitarian judgment of the colonized population's alleged moral inferiority.
And the long-term impact was severe. Later scholars, like Max Miller, strongly criticized Mill's influence, stating it contributed to some of the greatest misfortunes in India. Miller specifically urged British rulers to shake off national prejudices, which are apt to degenerate into a kind of madness.
Okay.
The contrast is just stunning. The application of radical reason at home led to freedom. The application of the same reason abroad led to systemic control and prejudice.
Let's turn now to Mill's other massive intellectual undertaking, his 1821 work, Elements of Political Economy. This book was hugely important because it took the ideas of the emerging Ricardian school classical economics and it systematized them into a single, cohesive, and remarkably rigorous text.
Yeah, and he starts by providing a really clear definition of the scope of the discipline. He uses a beautiful, simple analogy. Political economy is to the state what domestic economy is to the family.
Okay.
It says a household has to manage its resources to meet its needs. The state has to manage the resources of the entire community.
And what's the grand goal of this management?
The grand concern is the indefinite nature of human desire. Since the desire for enjoyment or consumption is always indefinite, humans always want more, the focus of the state must be on increasing the means of meeting those desires. So, increasing supply, or what he calls wealth. This immediately establishes the production of wealth as the central focus of the science.
One of the most subtle but philosophically important sections is his definition of production and the role of labor versus nature. He argues famously that labor only produces effects by conspiring with the laws of nature. Man doesn't actually create matter.
This is a crucial philosophical distinction, and it comes from his background in radical empiricism. Man merely produces motion. Think about it. A man doesn't create the spark or the explosive force. He moves sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter together to form gunpowder, and then moves a flame to it. The properties of matter, the inherent laws of nature, perform the rest.
So if a man moves an acorn into the ground and a giant oak tree grows, the human labor was just the movement of the acorn.
Right. But the properties of the earth and the seed perform the overwhelming majority of the physical effect.
Wow.
Exactly. Mill stresses that we move things toward or away from each other. That is the extent of human production. And he concludes that it is absurd to ask to which effect the properties of matter contribute most, seeing they contribute everything. This radical view puts human labor into sharp focus. Labor is the application of motion that utilizes natural laws to yield desired results.
And this systematic approach allows Mill to categorize the entire discipline into 4 discrete and logically flowing inquiries, which serve as the structure for the elements.
Yes, the 4 grand inquiries that organize political economy. First, you have production. This section focuses on the laws governing the creation of commodities that necessarily require human labor. Second is distribution. This examines the laws governing how those produced commodities are divided within the community, which includes the critical concepts of wages, rent, and profit.
Okay, and then we shift to the transactional parts of the economy.
Third is exchange, or interchange. Understanding the laws governing how commodities are exchanged for one another, which leads into the theories of value and money. And finally, consumption. regulating how commodities are ultimately used up and whether they're consumed productively to create new wealth or unproductively just to satisfy immediate desire. Mill's genius here was taking these disparate concepts from Adam Smith and David Ricardo and building them into this rigorous, almost Euclidean structure.
Moving into production, Mill immediately identifies the division of labor as the single greatest engine of efficiency. He argues that efficiency doesn't come from some intrinsic magic, but from repeating operations quickly and correctly. And this requires breaking down the immense aggregate of operations into the smallest possible specialized portions.
And this repetition is what creates skill and speed. Mill's analogy of the practiced drummer versus the novice is perfect here. The novice struggles with timing and coordination, while the practiced hand achieves astonishing rapidity because the motions just become habitual and automatic.
We see the raw power of specialization in his real-world examples. He uses the dedicated nailer. A common blacksmith, performing operations that are similar to the nailer's, struggles to make maybe 300 nails in a day, and they're often poor quality.
But the specialist, the dedicated nailer, focusing solely on that singular function, can produce upwards of 2,300 nails a day. That level of efficiency is the foundation of national wealth.
And Mill also points out that this division of labor wasn't some late industrial development. It appeared early in human society.
Right, he notes separate hands for spinning and weaving or tanning and shoemaking. This early specialization immediately leads to greater abundance and prosperity for the community.
Now, to sustain that labor and specialization, you need resources, which brings us to the concept of capital.
Mill defines capital as the provision which is made of these instruments, meaning the tools, machines, raw materials, but also the food and necessaries required to sustain the laborers during the production process.
And tracing its origins, he notes that the very first portion of capital was the result of pure labor without any previous instruments.
Right, a man forming a tool with his bare hands. But once that first tool exists, new instruments are rapidly made to assist the formation of others. For example, using a sharp stone or knife to aid in forming a bow. So, capital is simply the accumulated output of past labor that is preserved and directed to facilitate future labor. It's the savings that empower tomorrow's production.
And this naturally leads us into distribution, specifically the wages earned by the laborers, and this is where James Mill adopts Malthusian principles wholesale, creating what became the most profound anxiety of classical economics, the population problem.
This demographic relationship defines the entire distribution segment. Mill posits that wages depend entirely on the proportion between the total population and the fund of employment, which is capital, and the relationship is stark. If population increases faster than capital, wages must fall.
And when wages fall to the point of bare subsistence, you enter what he calls the natural state.
The natural state of poverty, misery, vice, and increased mortality, until population growth is forcefully checked.
He even emphasizes the terrifying power of biological increase by doing the math, calculating the possible rate of increase based on human physiology.
Yeah, he takes the childbearing years in Europe, say from 20 to 45, and assumes a birth every 2 years. And even after making extremely ample deductions for mortality, barrenness, and sickness, in fact, deducting 1/2 of the potential births, he still concludes that a healthy pair would typically rear 5 children.
So the population has this inherent biological capacity to double itself in a very short time.
In a small number of years, yeah. That growth potential is massive, it's constant, and it's inherently exponential.
So the dilemma is clear. Biology guarantees rapid, explosive growth of population, but what constrains the growth of capital? Why doesn't capital keep pace?
Mill argues that capital has a less natural tendency to increase than population, precisely because capital accumulation requires sacrifice, the willingness to defer immediate consumption or immediate enjoyment. And this constraint is rooted in social behavior, and he divides it into 2 distinct cases.
The first case involves impoverished or rigidly stratified communities.
Right. If poverty is widespread, the poor can't save anything because their entire income is consumed by necessities. Conversely, the rich, who have large fortunes, they have little incentive to save further. As Mill says, the possession of a large fortune generally whets the appetite for immediate enjoyment, and they lack the motivation to defer pleasure just to accumulate more.
And the second case, which is maybe more applicable to a rising industrial society where incomes are moderate.
Even there, the desire for immediate enjoyment and the desire to save are in competition. People might save enough to secure a moderate fortune for themselves or their children, but the inherent desire for present comfort resists the effort required for large-scale, continuous accumulation. So unless the conditions are absolutely perfect, capital accumulation naturally lags behind population's exponential potential.
Which sets the stage for the inevitable tragedy unless society acts. Since the natural state of falling wages leads to misery and vice, Mill argues that this cycle has to be broken by some means of forcibly regulating growth or accumulation.
Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like if you enjoy his deep dive.
We were just discussing Mill's Malthusian anxiety, this idea that society must forcibly regulate growth because capital accumulation just can't keep pace with biological reproduction. But direct legislative interference, like punishments or rewards for family size, that sounds like a nightmare to administer.
Mill thought so too. He deemed direct regulation problematic, difficult to define, and intrusive. And similarly, attempts to forcibly accelerate capital increase, say through aggressive taxation that the government then channels into investment, are also viewed as potentially destabilizing.
Why is forcing capital accumulation politically and socially undesirable in Mill's view?
Well, if the state forcibly accumulates capital and uses it to invest in land, and if land sales are rare, you end up creating a society dominated by a few wealthy landowners surrounded by hopelessly poor people, which leads to political instability. If, on the other hand, land is widely divided and everyone is dependent on wages, society is reduced to a fragile state of wages, where any minor reduction in annual produce or any economic shock would diffuse general, irremediable calamity. So the solution has to be preventative and moral, not solely based on forced economic accumulation.
Which means the focus has to shift to limiting births directly, but through indirect means.
Exactly. The ideal objective is to secure happiness from matrimonial union without the evils of too rapid population increase. And this requires limiting births to the number needed to maintain but not increase population while the return to capital is still high. So he suggests utilizing the powerful agency of the popular sanction.
The power of social norms and public opinion as a control mechanism.
Precisely. Mill envisioned that, through legislative action or general education, society could make frugality fashionable and expense disgraceful. He argued for directing an intense degree of disapprobation upon the men, who, by their folly, involved themselves through a great family in poverty and dependence, while offering approbation for those who exercise self-command.
This is a profoundly moral and cultural solution applied to an economic problem. He's asking society to change its fundamental values regarding family size to achieve economic stability, believing that the progress of legislation and the decay of superstition will make this cultural shift possible.
It reflects the utilitarian desire to apply reason to every single facet of human behavior. The limitation of births, if it's attained through this social discipline, is the master key, the single most effective tool capable of raising the condition of the laborer to any desired state of comfort and enjoyment. Without it, all other attempts at economic reform are ultimately doomed by Malthusian pressures.
So if distribution deals with the rewards of production, exchange deals with the mechanics of moving those commodities around. This is the third grand inquiry. An exchange occurs when people have an abundance of one commodity and a desire for another. The core question here is the determination of value.
And Mill provides one of the clearest classical statements on value. Value, meaning the quantity of one commodity that exchanges for another, depends on demand and supply in the first instance when we're looking at daily market fluctuations. But, he insists, ultimately and entirely, value depends on the cost of production.
So demand and supply can make the price of apples spike today, but what ultimately anchors the price of apples over the course of a year?
The cost of production. Competition is the mechanism that enforces this long-run truth. If a commodity is temporarily trading above its cost of production, meaning the labor and capital required to produce it, capitalists will immediately shift their resources into producing that profitable commodity. This rush increases supply, which drives the market price back down until it aligns perfectly with the cost of production.
And conversely, if a commodity's value falls below its cost of production,
Capital will flow out of that industry. Supply will shrink, and the price will rise back up. So competition ensures that, in the long run, the relative value of commodities will neither fall below nor rise above the total expense required to bring them to market. And this principle is just fundamental to the Ricardian framework that Mill championed.
okay, we can't discuss exchange without money. Money, usually precious metals and coin, solves the inherent problems of barter. You might want my chair, but I might not want your donkey, or the donkey might be too valuable to exchange for a single chair.
Right. Money acts as the convenient medium of exchange and a unit of account. It divides value into manageable portions and allows for generalized trade. The critical question then becomes, what regulates the value of money itself?
And Mill's answer here is precise and impactful.
The value of money, the proportion in which it exchanges for other commodities, is determined by the total quantity of money in circulation in a country. This is a crucial concept. If the quantity of money increases, its value decreases. And prices, which are just the quantity of money given in exchange for a commodity, must rise proportionally across all goods.
So if you double the money supply, assuming output stays the same, money's purchasing power gets cut in half and prices double.
Exactly.
But if that money is based on specie, like gold or silver, what regulates the quantity of that metal?
Well, the quantity of grain is naturally regulated by the value of the metal, which, like other ordinary commodities, is determined by its cost of production. Gold and silver are commodities acquired through labor and capital, usually extracted from mines. If the market value of money as a coin drops below its value as raw bullion, people will just melt the coin down for use in industry or export, reducing the quantity in circulation until the coin's value equalizes with its commodity value again.
This mechanical regulation of metallic currency sets the stage for the next logical step, the paper substitute. Mill traces the concept back to its origins.
He attributes the early mechanism to bills of exchange, which he links to the Jews in feudal ages. These bills allowed distant countries to settle large mutual debts by simply offsetting obligations against each other, and that eliminated the massive expense and security risk of physically transmitting large quantities of gold. It was an efficiency mechanism.
And what are the advantages when paper substitutes the circulating coin entirely?
There are two great advantages for the nation. First, the enormous benefit of releasing productive capital. The land, labor, and capital that were otherwise consumed to acquire or maintain gold and silver for exchange can instead be converted into productive instruments: food, tools, machinery, raw materials. This fundamentally increases the country's overall productive powers.
So essentially, instead of digging gold out of the ground just to use it for payments, you can use paper, and the labor that was digging the gold can now be digging potatoes or building a new machine.
Precisely. And the second advantage is simply convenience. In large sums, counting cumbersome metallic coin is slow and risky. Paper notes allow the largest transactions to be executed rapidly. It provides unmatched convenience in commerce.
But the risks inherent in paper money are significant, particularly concerning stability and inflation.
Yes, the risks are primarily twofold. One is the possibility of the failure of the issuers, the banks, to redeem their notes, though Mill suggests that having numerous competitive local banks encourages vigilance and limits the damage of any single failure. But the main systemic risk is inflation or depreciation.
And this happens when the issuing party increases the quantity too freely.
Correct. The issuing body, whether it's private or government, might deliberately or accidentally increase the quantity of paper beyond what the underlying metallic value would support. And this leads to a loss of the paper's value, a general rise in all prices, and a severe injustice to anyone owed fixed sums of money, a concept that Mill viewed as profoundly damaging to social contracts.
Finally, within this discussion on exchange, Mill critiques international trade practices, particularly colonial trade monopolies. And this links right back to his work at India House. What's his position on free trade versus the mother country compelling a colony to buy and sell exclusively to it?
Mill's free trade principle is absolute. A country will import a commodity if it costs less to acquire by exporting another commodity than it would cost to produce that first commodity at home. The ultimate goal is always to maximize efficiency, meaning commodities are produced with the smallest possible cost of labor, benefiting everyone.
So what happens when a colonial monopoly is imposed?
Mill is highly analytical about this. He dismisses the idea that the mother country gains any special profit just from supplying the colony under monopoly because competition among the mother country's own merchants keeps profits down to the ordinary rate.
So where does the exploitation occur?
The advantage, if one exists, is derived from forcing the colony to sell goods, like sugar or coffee, so cheaply that they glut the mother country's domestic market, lowering the price of that commodity below what other countries would have been willing to pay. And this gain is extracted entirely at the colony's expense. Under free trade, both parties gain through comparative advantage. Under a forced colonial monopoly, whatever is gained by the mother country is necessarily lost by the colony. Mill sees this as pure exploitation that benefits domestic consumers, not necessarily the domestic producers.
We transition now to the final inquiry, consumption. As we noted, Mill rigorously separates this into two categories, depending on whether the act of consumption supports future wealth or, well, ends it.
And the distinction is vital for understanding a nation's prosperity. Productive consumption means consuming commodities as a means to future production. This includes the necessaries required by the laborer, food, housing, fuel, machinery, and raw material. Critically, in productive consumption, nothing is lost. If one thing is destroyed, say coal is burned, another is simultaneously produced, say textiles are woven, the wealth is replaced or even augmented.
And then there's unproductive consumption.
Unproductive consumption is strictly consumption purely for immediate enjoyment or pleasure. It is the final end goal of all previous economic operations. Whatever is consumed unproductively is permanently lost to the national stock because nothing is produced in return to replace it. It is a sheer diminution of wealth for the individual or for the community.
We touched on government consumption before. Since the state is necessary for protection and order, where does Mill place its spending?
Mill classifies government consumption as inherently unproductive. While it's essential for social order, a prerequisite for all other production, the resources consumed by the state, salaries, supplies, materials, are not replaced by a new, tradable produce. It is consumption as an end.
Okay.
And this leads to a strong warning. Government revenue must come from the annual produce of the nation, and the government can only consume the capital stock itself for a very short time. Persistent capital consumption reduces the productive powers of the nation and will inevitably annihilate its prosperity.
This emphasis on the necessity of consumption being merely a means to production brings us to Mill's most famous and rigorous theoretical contribution, his absolute forceful rejection of the general glut doctrine. This was a concept often associated with Malthus, the idea that there could be aggregate overproduction where the total supply exceeds the total demand, leading to permanent economic stagnation.
Mill argues that a general glut is a theoretical impossibility. He thinks it's rooted in confusing localized market miscalculation with a fundamental failure of the entire economy. He stresses the two conditions necessary to constitute demand. First, a genuine wish for the commodity, and second, an equivalent to give for it, the means of purchasing.
And since every single person who supplies a commodity is doing so to obtain the equivalent needed to purchase something else,
The conclusion is inexorable. Supply creates its own demand. Every creation of capital is the creation of a demand, Mill states, channeling Say's law. Because the commodity supplied is simultaneously the instrument of demand used to purchase something else, the total supply and total demand in the aggregate are mathematically and necessarily equal.
so while I might produce too many shoes and the shoe market gluts, the resources I use to produce those shoes are the means by which I enter the market to demand bread, clothing, and machinery. The error is specific, not aggregate.
Precisely. That specific oversupply is just a miscalculation in particular markets, and it's easily corrected by price changes and the resulting flow of capital to more desired sectors. And Mill directly addressed Malthus's fear that high wages caused by capital accumulation would lead to idleness and reduced production, thereby causing this general glut because workers wouldn't feel the need to work.
And how does Mill counter that very human fear?
He counters it with empirical observation. He argues that where wages are excessively low, and he uses Ireland as his example, there is profound misery, and consequently there is little to no industry because the poor are struggling simply to survive.
Right.
But where wages are excessively high, such as in the American United States, there is the greatest possible industry. High wages are a stimulus, encouraging greater effort and self-command, not a detriment to production. The argument for an aggregate glut, he concludes, is a reply in words only.
Let's finalize our systematic review by examining how the government, which is engaged in necessary but unproductive consumption, raises the revenue it needs. Mill establishes that government revenue must ultimately come from one of three sources: rent, profits, or wages.
And this final segment circles right back to his core principle. Whatever the means of revenue extraction, the absolute imperative is not to permanently consume capital. Otherwise, the nation's productive powers will be annihilated. And his arguments concerning land rent are perhaps the most innovative and politically challenging of his taxation theories.
This stems from the theory of rent, where rent accrues on land above the barren level because land differs in fertility. The rent is essentially the surplus yield above what's necessary to cover the maintenance of labor and the ordinary profit on capital invested.
And what Mill identifies is the unearned increment. Over time, rent increases not because the landlord did anything, but because of external factors, legislative action, population growth, and the resulting rising demand for food and housing. This increase, the the unearned increment, is easily distinguishable from the original rent upon which property expectations were based when the land was initially acquired.
And he argues this unearned increase can be considered a just subject for peculiar taxation. Why is this specific increase different from taxing profits?
Because profits are the essential motive force for accumulation. Profits decrease naturally in the progress of society, and they must be rigorously secured to incentivize the preservation and augmentation of capital, which is the product of human industry and sacrifice.
Got it.
Land, on the other hand, exists by the gift of nature. Rent is essentially a deduction from the overall profits of the economy. For the preservation of the land itself, it's unimportant to whom the rent is consigned, whether to a private landlord or the state.
So, taxing the future increase in rent doesn't disincentivize production in the same way that taxing profits does. And this makes it, in Mill's utilitarian calculus, a more equitable form of taxation.
Precisely. He even cites the example of countries like the United States retaining control of unappropriated land to reserve the rent for state service as an effective model for capturing this unearned increment for the benefit of the community without impeding productive effort.
What about taxing profits directly? He established that profits are the lifeblood of accumulation.
A direct tax on profits would fall entirely on the owners of capital. Crucially, Mill argues it could not be shifted to others as all capitalists would be affected equally, leaving no incentive for any one capitalist to raise prices over another. Such a tax wouldn't alter demand, supply, or the value of money. However, it would undeniably lessen the means and incentive for capital accumulation, thereby slowing long-term economic growth. It's a choice between immediate, easy revenue and the nation's future prosperity.
And finally, the tax on wages. This depends heavily on whether the laborer is earning the absolute minimum required for subsistence.
Mill applies the Ricardian definition of the lowest point, wages barely sufficient to keep up the number of laborers, avoiding misery and starvation. If wages are truly at this minimum, a tax on wages cannot fall upon the laborer. If it did, the laborer would die or cease reproduction, reducing the population and driving wages back up.
So the tax has to be shifted.
Therefore, if wages are at subsistence, the tax must, by necessity, be shifted to profits.
But if wages are higher than this minimum,
If wages afford the laborer some surplus, something that could be retrenched without reducing the necessary population, then the tax would fall upon the laborer to the extent of that surplus. Ultimately, the question of whether a wage tax is borne by the working class or the capitalists depends entirely on that fundamental proportion between capital, the wages fund, and population. James Mill's influence is colossal because he wasn't just observing economics or politics. He was attempting to create comprehensive, rigorous systems designed to maximize utility and happiness. His roles span the entire intellectual landscape of his time, from institutional reform at home to the systematic administration of empire abroad.
okay, let's consolidate the central statements for you, the listener, as three core takeaways. First, as a historian and administrator, James Mill established the influential and deeply prejudiced Hindu-Muslim-British framework for Indian history. He justified colonialism as a calculated civilizing mission and used his powerful position at India House to implement institutional changes based on his profoundly negative, though entirely archival, assessment of Indian society.
Second, as an economist, he formalized political economy into its four inquiries: production, distribution, exchange, and consumption. He rigorously systematized core classical theories, establishing that value is rooted in the cost of production in the long run. And crucially, he highlighted the Malthusian threat that population tends to outgrow capital, arguing this required profound social discipline and indirect legislative ingenuity to restrain births.
And third, as a radical thinker, he was pivotal in the philosophic radical movement, championing utilitarianism in politics, successfully arguing for good government secured by wider democratic participation, and demonstrating foresight by advocating for the taxation of unearned increases in land rent.
And this brings us back to the inherent tension in Mill's work, a provocative thought to leave you with. Here was a philosopher, an atheist, and a champion of rational self-command and political liberty for the British citizen. Yet this very system of rational utility, when applied internationally, provided the theoretical justification for perpetual, forceful colonial rule based on the moral inferiority of the governed population. It compels us to ask, how did the utilitarian calculation that led to liberation in one sphere simultaneously lay the foundation for domination in another? And what does that reveal about the inherent cultural and intellectual biases embedded within even the most seemingly rational systems?